Good evening. I'm Dr. David Canton, the director of the African American Studies program at the University of Florida. I'm pleased to introduce an exclusive film screening of director Dick Fontaine's I Heard It Through the Grapevine, a film about James Baldwin in the United States looking at African American progress after the Civil Rights Movement. To me, this film documents the ongoing struggles of African Americans against institutional racism. He interviews former civil rights activists Fred Shuttlesworth, Hosea Williams, and Dave Dennis and asks their opinion about Black progress after the movement. And all three agreed that housing, education, and police brutality are ongoing issues in Black America. Now, while the film is an hour and a half, I think one part, which we should talk about later, is in spite of those realities, during that same period from 1968 to 1980, there was a growing Black middle class, politicians, businessmen and women, and educators. So we still see the relevancy in terms of Black community of middle class, upper middle class, but at the same time, we see African Americans disproportionately poor. So make sure you keep that in mind as you watch the film. The Center for African Studies would like to thank Dick Fontaine and the Harvard Film Archives for granting us access to share this film tonight. For anyone interested in viewing this film again after the event, please visit www.dickfontaine.com, where you can purchase I Heard It Through the Grapevine and other Dick Fontaine films. Now, without further ado, please enjoy I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Well, good evening. How's everybody doing? Thanks for coming out tonight to the Achebe Baldwin event. And I'm Dr. David Canton, and I'll be the first to just give a little 2-minute conversation about I Heard It on the Grapevine. And obviously, I'm a trained historian, so I New Orleans, and the argument comes up there's been no change, right? King was assassinated in 1968, so Rights Act passed 64, Voting Rights Act 65, and by 1980, we start seeing the grinding poverty in these urban areas. But let me give you a little context. Deindustrialization, all those factory jobs left the cities, right? High wages, benefits, overtime, deindustrialization, increase of crime in the late 60s because of deindustrialization. So by the time Black mayors took over, you had all those jobs gone, disappearing. You also had in 1965, you had the war on poverty. If you read Elizabeth Hinton's book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, LBJ was funneling federal money in urban cities for the police. Okay, so the crime tick was increasing in the mid 60s, and also they criminalized the protest. So many people look at Nixon, but according to Hinton, it's in the mid 60s when these policies, so deindustrialization, war on poverty, war on crime, all these factors came at once. So by the time Black elected officials become mayors in Newark and Gary and these other cities, these were these economic realities. So on the ground, you don't see these structures of global capitalism, racial capitalism. So what you see is stagnation. But the reality is in Atlanta, those cities are Black middle class of elected official, state workers, federal workers, because of the civil rights struggle. So it's two things at once. On the one hand, you have Black poverty rates decreasing, a Black middle class, but there's also that grinding poverty rooted in a global capitalism, all happening at one time. That's obviously after hindsight of 2020, but those policies were occurring as Carter was running for president, Reagan comes in, cuts unions, and my last point, they had this thing called a Comprehensive Employment Training Act in 74 that created federal jobs like the New Deal. Reagan cuts that program and has job training. So we know in Black cities, teenagers have double unemployment rates. So all these factors go at the same time. So on one hand, it creates a high degree of pessimism, nothing changes. But as a historian, that's not true. Last point, if you went to Atlanta in 1980, there was a Black middle class because of that airport in Maynard Jackson. Created all those millionaires through those contracts. However, on the flip side, there was a poverty as well. But poverty rates were decreasing because of the civil rights movement. So I just want to contextualize all these things going on that oftentimes get missed when you're on the ground. So it's all these factors, and I'm gonna stop there.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So
I'm the last.
I'll make a
Mhm.
few remarks. It's a little intimidating to come in the wake of that movie, and it's really
Yeah.
captivating and harrowing. It's particularly captivating and harrowing to be watching it amid the chaos and uncertainty that's unfolding right now. And one gets a sense of almost of a cyclic repetition of tragedies where progress happens and a swift backlash happens subsequently. Um, However, I want to come at it obliquely somewhat. Um, the One of the last images of the movie is when James Baldwin, confronted with a racist interruption, defiantly says, uh, "The age of white supremacy is over," and it's a really powerful rebuttal to the interruption. But the statement is quite obviously not true, as the present moment is making quite clear, which is not to suggest that there hasn't been any progress, but clearly the age of white supremacy was not over. And um, the other thing that I wanted to address is uh, Achebe's rather muted presence in the movie. And perhaps the most useful way I thought of addressing it was uh, if Achebe, who came of age in late colonial Africa, uh, um, if he were to take the same retrospective tour of the continent as Baldwin was, what would he have made of it? And one of the images, again, that came from early in the movie was when Baldwin talks about the way uh, Martin Luther King has been turned into a monument precisely by being denuded of its radical critique. And I wonder if, in an oblique way, there is a danger that Achebe himself has been turned into some kind of a monument. I have in mind precisely the fetishization of things fall apart and a certain selective reading of the novel in terms of its withering anti colonial critique. But the novel also contains a chillingly prescient warning at a time when Africa was being swept up by optimistic, if not triumphant, anti colonial nationalism. And in a sense, the story of post colonial Africa can be crystallized in terms of the warning not heeded and the ways in which uh, the decolonial project fails and produces the same kinds of disappointment and disillusion that we witnessed in the movie. I have in mind, for instance, even as the US is roiling with protest against police brutality and the continued brutalization of Black bodies, we have analogous brutalization of Black bodies taking place in Africa, not least in Achebe's native Nigeria, where under an ostensible democratic governance, we are witnessing the killing of civilians, ironically, when they're protesting the killing of civilians by gangster police units. And I was also struck by uh, shortly after the George Floyd murder and the protests in the US, there were what began as small but, to my mind, consequential solidarity protests in Kenya. Uh, but very quickly, they became about police brutality in post colonial Kenya and the need to decolonize the Kenyan police fully half a century after the decolonization of the country. And so I am just tracing out in a quick and dirty way what I see as parallels between the two authors, both as participants in history, but also as chroniclers whose critical age is somewhat muted. And the last comment I will make is uh, Baldwin talks about at some point there's a elegiac note where he's talking about Medgar Evers is dead and Malcolm is dead and Martin Luther King is dead. And then he also goes on and says something to the effect, I wonder about the, he doesn't use the phrase I'm about to use, the unacknowledged dead, the unmourned dead, the casualties of the struggle that nobody remembers, the non-big names. And I'm reminded of one of the texts I like to teach a lot is um, The Island by the South African writers Athol Fugard, John Carney, and Winston Shorner. And the text celebrates a performance of Sophocles' Antigone in prison in South Africa. And it's this very, very romanticized moment about uh, self-sacrificing heroism. But what's not often observed is the actor that provided the impetus for that play came out of prison a bitter, broken, and defeated man. And I remember in conversation, Fugard saying to me, for everyone Nelson Mandela, there are 5 people who were crushed by the experience of struggle and that their stories are not told. And I think this circles back to the questions of how we remember and those that become monuments and the way monuments denude history and depth and so on. I think I'll stop at that point.
I'm fascinated by the information sharing that's going on. The movie itself just brings so many raw feelings for me because as we study what happened, I lived most of what happened. So I really like to get my feet firmly planted on the ground because what I really want young folks to know is that before they started what they're doing now, and I'm so very proud of what's going on now, African Americans in small cities all over the United States and maybe beyond live the same lives as the people did in this film. There were maids going to work that were doing whatever and being treated in whatever way, but we were all on the ground trying to do what it would take for us to have our freedom. So there were maids marching and there were teachers marching together, trying to come together so that we might bring about this integration that we wanted. Not so much that we reach the biggest house on the corner, but just so that we could go to work and get the pay at the level that everybody else was going. So I think about when I'm often asked questions, I like for people to talk really firmly and succinctly about racism as it relates to the system that was created by the people who are at the majority. And I talk about the fact that systemic racism guides even the Black person who is elected into that office, or who takes on the role as a policeman, that can go no further than the system. And even though they may be a little more humane, the system still does say if you are the little Black man with a small amount of marijuana, you get the longest sentence. So if we don't get into the position of changing the laws, electing the folk who make the system, it's his system, it's not our system. So I like to talk about really working from that level up, and then talk about the fact that folk would like to relate indentured slavery with the slavery of African Americans, and it's just not the same. Chattel is not the same as indentured. You just heard that on the film that we're property. Well, property is not indentured. It was a different story altogether. So in my head, I have all these eclectic things going on, but I really want to hear what the questions are because I'm fascinated by the information from you two gentlemen, because I think it's so important that our young people know what you know, and that our young people know that they have all of this stability to stand on. And like the little fellow said in the film, we're tired of it. The young people are tired of it. And I think in order to bring about a change, we have to work from the system up. But we cannot let people forget to talk about and realize that they were in the position, even though they didn't sit in the seat their parents did and their foreparents did. So they must pay the price for what they did, as we must live the life that we had to live because of them. So, on the University of Florida campus, you have Granter Hall and all of these racist people who were professors there. I know about Granter because my mother worked for him. So there are others too. But, all of these buildings and all these monuments, and we're lording them all over the nation, but they were not good people.
Mm.
But our children don't know that. So they hold them in high esteem. And I'm saying until we find out who buried who and who did the lynchings in Newberry that we hear about. I know of other folk who sit in my seat who has a father that was almost lynched. My daddy was just 2 inches from being lynched for something that he did not do. So that's why I'm saying that my generation lived it really painfully. And when I see it and hear it, it brings tears to my eyes, but not so much so that I'm blinded. I want to speak. I really think I want to speak, and I do, to the fact that there's a lot to be done, and we cannot stand on our laurels and say it has been done, because what we have achieved is not integration. We have a little desegregation going on, but the money is not here. And we have not integrated the green dollar in with the Black lives. And until we get to a position that we are able to do that, I don't think we've reached anywhere near where we want to be. And I'll stop there. So we're at questions now.
I'll send in the chat. I guess they'll come in through the chat.
Mhm. Okay, well, I'll let you guys go with that.
Okay. Well,
I can't even see.
uh, you heard it. Oh, questions are up there. Those are statements. I don't see a question. Karen Coker.
Mhm.
Oh, the first one looked like a statement. The images, the city removed Confederate Memorial statute. Questions are up there. I guess the Sarah Strominger, the images of St. Augustine are so familiar and powerful. That plaza where the slave market has been the site of many protests just recently removed the Confederate Memorial statute from there. Well, that's been Ms. Fowler, you want to take that one? That's been a big debate all summer. Confederate monuments coming
Yes,
down. Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and take care of that one?
yes, and fairly so. Uh, Parks are being renamed, buildings are being renamed, all for the good of the order. Why should we hold in high esteem these people who did all these horrible things? I don't care who doesn't like it. I don't care who says that's our history. It is not a good history for us. And since we didn't bother to write our history, since they didn't decide to write our history as it occurred, I don't think we should let our children hold these folk in high esteem who were the very perpetrators of all this evil. It takes a pretty evil person to do what these folk have done. So we need to hold them accountable. I often say when I was a civil rights marcher, I sat in the middle of the street, I did all of that. But what I have said on panels here lately is that, and especially if it's a mixed panel, I want to know when I was walking past a white school, 3 blocks or 4 blocks or 10 blocks in the rain to go to the one black school, I want to know what that white child was thinking and that white parent that sent that child there, what were they thinking? One of my friends said to me one time, well, I lived in Maine. I didn't see black people. I lived in Ohio. I didn't see black people. And I stopped him. And I'm a faculty, we equal. I said, I don't want anybody else to say that.
Mm.
Because didn't you wonder where we were? There's no excuse. You had to know that I was somewhere, then it was up to you to find out why I was there and what was happening to there. So I don't want to let people off the hook
Mm.
for what has been done. because they're saying, why don't they get over it? And they don't know the it. So I certainly hope, I mean, I love what you young men are doing because you're teaching the it and you're giving it the back, you're giving it the educational background that I don't have in it. I just have the soul and the heart that's lived it. So I really do think, and James Baldwin was always an idol. In our black schools, we read James Baldwin. Baldwin. We read all the black books. And when they integrated, guess what? In Gainesville, Florida, they left the black libraries, all the black books in them, and moved all our black kids into white schools. I know that as a fact because my friends were teachers. So, we can't let that happen. We have got to teach our children, and we have to send our children to places where you can teach our children so that we can cut back on this. I'll cut it out.
I hear, but that's why I like the intergenerational conversation. So for me, when you watch those
Hmm.
Eyes on the Prize videos, Cicero, 1966, those
Hmm.
folks are alive. And you see the
Hmm.
hostility in their eyes, like what are they doing today?
Yes.
Are they less
Yes.
hostile? They know what's going on. So students, as a historian, and I try to bring that passion, sit down, really think about, how silly racism is, going to the store, all the nonsense you put up with. And it's just, you got to remind
Hmm.
students, because the millennials, because you can watch a black movie, they just don't understand the depth and the violence. And that's why the intergenerational
Hmm.
conversation you're sharing, and I see that passion coming out.
Hmm.
I get to say, and I didn't live it, but I
Hmm.
read the documents. Doesn't make any sense. You saw Ben
Yeah.
Chain. I just looked him up. He went to jail.
Hmm.
He's out. He's a lawyer now, paralegal in New York. So what happened was, in
Hmm.
1980, he was in Florida with the Black Liberation Army. Because of his name,
Hmm.
about 10 years. He's in New York, but you just saw his
Hmm.
pain and agony. And how do we teach empathy for African Americans? I think
Hmm.
that's the billion dollar. We don't get the same empathy because there's belief that black
Right.
people get free stuff, all this free stuff,
Hmm.
all that free stuff,
Hmm.
dead black bodies and protein, nothing free.
That's right.
There hasn't been one president that woke up and said, "Oh, my bad, we're gonna help black people." Not one. It's all through struggle, and that's what I try to tell
Hmm.
students, and that's why I show the videos. Have you come in and get that passion and energy? And it's not about hate. No, it's just about understanding and how do you move forward.
That's right. Hmm.
Karen. Okay, Karen. Apollo, you want to handle that one? Let's see. Karen Coker Baldwin, description of his journey from Birmingham to Selma. He felt he'd come home, the landscape, and the significance of those who had traversed this space for generations. Where are the trees? The journey of coming home was to confront, but the confrontation of injustice was at surface level at a time in the 60s, and still today, even when injustice is confronted, is at the surface with no lasting. That's always a big quote. Like people say social justice movement. I think Americans know what justice look like. I think Americans might have a better idea, but what does justice look like? People always say that. What does that
Hmm.
mean? What does that look like, a just society?
Is that a
You want
question?
to go, Apollo?
Asking you, Apollo, I'm just trying to, she said injustice is
Oh,
confronted at the surface. So it sounds like there's a deeper level, or, what is,
what what justice looks like what they get and we don't, if you want to go that route. Justice looks like um, leveling the field. Justice looked like us realizing that we had property and we had value and we had all of these things that have succinctly been taken away from us or we've given away because we had no choice over time. Justice is putting us back where we get what our parents and our forefathers have fought for and have paid for and have given their lives for. So we're nowhere near getting to justice. I'll be dead before we get to that point. But if we can make a crack on it right now, I think young people are more in tune to I'm not having any more of this and I'm ready to speak of it. And I'm so happy that they are because they're so verbal and they're so bold and they're so educated and they're so wise. And I am so excited about that because up to this point, folks have been rubbing themselves on the back and feeling good
Mhm.
that they have done a great job. And we have not moved. We have not moved. And now I hope that this is the time.
Okay. Go ahead, Apollo, your take.
I think that's an unanswerable question. I think it's context specific and um, it presents different challenges at different historical moments and different possibilities. Um, yeah, I think that's the best I can do.
Well, something
Hard question.
that, the way capitalism is in itself, the capitalist enterprise, and inherently in itself, the racist capitalist enterprise, is in itself inherently is not just, right? Because we know that justice depends on your money. Ask OJ. I'm
Hmm.
saying, but
Hmm.
some would say we need a whole new system. And again, there's no utopia, but a system, as you notice, right? Judicial system, all these institutions need to be what King was talking about, radically transformed. But we just do a lot of reformation, little dots and but really transforming the judicial system, transforming how we fund public education, transforming how we treat women, transforming. It's so much, it's so layered, and oftentimes students, yes, there's been progress, but these systemic changes gets talked about as socialism. Everybody gets scared and nervous. We're all going to be broke and all these exaggerations, rather than really sitting down and thinking, what does that look like? So these are the
Hmm.
concepts I try to have in the classroom, get them out the narrow box of what they just know. You know, here's
Hmm.
one.
Hmm.
In Baldwin's debate with Buckley, I remember him, the conservative guy. Buckley started by saying he couldn't fully regard Baldwin's arguments without first addressing him as if he was a white man. What do each of you think of that? Not directly related to the film, but related to the struggle of never truly being heard, understood. The trauma keeps compounding.
Um, I think watching those debates was a little bit like Chinese water torture. Um, and I think Baldwin was a saint to suffer through them.
Mm,
And I think that opening remark um, captures the insulting nature of the whole exchange, where one person was arguing in bad faith and one person was attempting to at least persuade those in the audience that were open to be persuaded.
mm, mm-hmm,
And based on the history that here to that point, they were used to being in that position. It was their position. It was their right to downgrade this black person and have the wherewithal and just feel good about the fact that he could just say that to Mr. Baldwin. It's just that Baldwin was smart enough to answer him back at his level, which is something he never expected, I'm sure. So, I came from the era where black fathers had to teach their children to be reticent, to step back if they want them to come home alive at the end of the day. So, I have a TED talk in case you all want to watch it.
okay.
It's Lessons from My Sidewalk, Vivian Filer, and a TED
Mm,
talk. And I talk about that, the fact that our parents had to teach us that. I wasn't easily taught. My mother was not happy with that, but like it is now, we're still doing that, aren't we? Are we telling our black boys and to what they have to do to stay alive, and our black girls what they have to do to stay alive? So that's what this man had the right. He thought he had the right to address Baldwin in that manner, and so blatant in doing that.
That's a good point, right? Systemic, right? So again, it's not
Hmm.
exactly the same.
Hmm.
But we look at a system,
Hmm.
racist capital, it
Hmm.
changes, hegemony,
Hmm.
it adapts.
Hmm.
Okay, that old model, look at voter suppression.
Hmm.
I don't need a gun.
Hmm.
I need a policy.
Hmm.
I don't need all that.
Hmm.
That's too much work. I'm just going to change the
Yeah,
rule, but same outcome. So, like you
that's
said,
right.
tell black students when you go in the car, the whole ritual. That's what we mean about
Hmm.
systemic, and stop just
Hmm.
accepting. Well, at least it's not, but it's the same system, right? So
Hmm.
voter suppression is just more sophisticated, right? There's no more all that beating people up. It's just more through policy. But the thing about, like you said, Buckley, and Buckley was a little arrogant. Don't even start on him, but
Hmm.
that's the whole thing about obviously racism. Black people are irrational, not smart, also the nonsense. Again, through African American studies, is that what I call it white worshiping. We have none of that. We're all human beings.
Hmm.
Everybody's smart. Stop going crazy. Relax. You can do it. You can do whatever you want to do. So you try to empower students in a culture that says, unless it's sports or singing, when it comes to brain stuff, none of that in here. You know, everyone can debate anybody once you have the tools and the confidence. That's all it is. So that's why I try to empower students, because I know the system
Yeah.
creates, even in the schools, some doubt. You can't get into UF. How about this? It still exists
Mm-hmm.
because that's the system. You know, so for students to
Mm-hmm.
understand, well, that's a good person. It's not about feelings. It's about the action
That's right.
and that. Forget about who's good. Who's most people are good. We're not in jail. Was about how they respond
Mm-hmm.
to the system that they never question. And that's what we try to promote in my classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the movie showed protests, funerals, missing young black men, us coming together and grasping for hope, the same things we're still dealing with in 2020. Oh, that's the. If anybody like to look, Dave Dennis, you can watch the whole speech in Eyes on the Prize. Is This America? It deals with Mississippi. Dave Dennis became a lawyer, and he works with Project Algebra with Bob Moses, a nonprofit teaching math literacy. So I did a little, I'm a historian. I'm a nerd. I looked it up, but yeah, those
Mm-hmm.
they're about 85. Bob Moses, they like Sister Fowler, they still around. They out here in the 80s, still doing
Mm-hmm.
their thing. That's why I brought Bob Moses to Connecticut College. Just love to just listen. I just shut up, let them listen,
Mm-hmm.
hear those stories, and they empower me to say, okay, I got to do more because they out here
Mm-hmm.
still doing it.
That,
That's right.
that comment kind of touches on what I was trying to get at somewhat obliquely, that this notion of history unfolding as something of a cyclic repetition of tragedy, which is again not to downgrade uh, progress or historical specificities, but one of Achebe's literary grandsons is a writer called Ben Okri, and he uses the concept of the spirit child, which features in Achebe's own writing. That is a child that haunts the world of the living uh, in a periodic basis, and he uses the notion of the spirit child and defines Nigeria, post-colonial Nigeria, as something of a spirit child and a Biku nation, a nation that's condemned to false starts and birth and death and birth and redeath, and it can be kind of pessimistic to watch that there are all these efforts at figuring things out, coming up with new constitutions, coming up with new structures, and uh, the structures of oppression seem to be remarkably resilient and adaptable. Um, I'm just sort of amplifying the comment rather than answering it. Or
Mm-hmm. Good. And all of these things that were so vivid during the time of real Jim Crow and even before are vivid now. They are just in a different room,
Different.
is so to speak. They're given new dressings.
Mhm.
That they are acceptable to certain people as their right. That is their right to do the same thing to African Americans as they have always done, and that to talk down, Buckley to Baldwin. That same thing they feel comfortable, or the idea that someone would say, uh, I didn't see African Americans, that in itself sets them apart because they could live in a world that completely separates them from a whole half of the nation. They had the right to not know us, but we intimately had to know them. And I taught nursing, and in one of my classes I taught how to take care of an African American woman's hair. Back in the day, you were not going to wash her hair every day. And so my white students said, well, you aren't going to teach how to wash the white hair? I said, no, we've been washing that since you were born. That wasn't something I needed to teach. I could have gotten fired many days, but that's the way I lived. But the fact that, if this was my 2 week time to the beauty parlor and you washed my hair, you were going to be in trouble. But see, they didn't know that about us, nor did they want to know. I had a dermatologist. I tried to explain to my sons a condition that has a skin color change. He said, haha, you can see a skin color change. All of us have red blood on our skin. So you can see that. But it's a whole nag of we don't exist. We don't exist to the point that it's important to know who we are and put us in the position of being a person.
That's a great point. We know in the field of, and again, institutions, medicine, biology, right? That Black people are different. You know, Tuskegee syphilis thing, right? We suffer differently, and that's the problem. You know, there's white med students. They did a survey. Black people feel less pain. There's still a belief that when you go to the hospital, I got a bullet in my head, you got a thorn, they're gonna leave today. He don't feel that. That's rooted in the medicine field today in 2020. The other point, like you said, I'm a historian. You know, if I do an interview, you know, I never heard of the New York Times, but I read a Black newspaper. So like you said, whites can go to the world not reading about African Americans and keep it moving, get applauded, get awarded. Yes. We know we're done. You know, you're not taken seriously. I'm hating people. If I don't read white books and newspapers who don't know, I hate people. You know, those are the things, again, we I talk to students about how these systems, but just oftentimes I think you're looking for victories, looking for nice people. I'm trying to, you know, but my friend, it's a system. Question those systems. Friend, let them question. So it's hard for them in 19 to, you know, when I was 19, I know everything, but it's hard for them to understand. That's the challenge we have as educators. How do we educate about a system, not just prejudice? I hate this and this. That's like level one, you know. But how do you understand like what you just said about the hospital, about judicial, all our institutions, our churches, right? White churches don't talk about racism. I don't think they do. You know.
They're Christians though.
Yeah. See that fire coming through. I see it.
I can't help it.
I read James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Great book. You should check out. You know, basically saying Jesus' crucifix was like a lynching. And James Cone, the Black theologian who grew up in Arkansas. And the book talks about as a kid, he used to wait up for his dad to come home because if he came home a minute late, you're thinking he might be killed. And he really describes that every day you cannot fall asleep or your heart's pumping, knowing when 6 o'clock, if he can come 5 minutes late, you're thinking the worst. I mean, that means amazing. Like, wow, that's not living. So again, that's pressure. My goodness.
Well, you know, I have to throw this in because I really have been a rebel, not without a cause, though. When I did a workshop on high blood pressure at one time, and we were talking about essential blood pressure, whichever blood pressure didn't have a real cause in the body, and African Americans suffered from that blood pressure more than high blood pressure more than anyone else. And somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, "Well, why do you think that is?" I said, "Well, it's called white folk." Think of how long we have been pressured through all of this stress. So that's what it's called. It's not non-essential. That's what's caused it. So anyway, I thought we might laugh a little.
Oh man, we go all night. But see, Molly messing around. That's that fire. I see it. Woo, man. Okay.
A little.
Yeah, check out that James Cone, the Cross and the Lynching Tree. Good stuff.
I will.
You'll like that. You know.
I will.
Any other question? I see my personal question. I guess it's late. People getting tired, or they want to go watch the debate with, you know, those two, you know, Trump and Biden.
I don't.
This is better. This is more informative. Any personal question?
No, she was explaining that that's the question that we were just discussing.
No more questions coming in. Well, it's 9:05. We could just, you know, I'll just like to add, I think I'm just new to the area, to Gainesville, so I'm learning a lot, you know, in terms of Baldwin, Achebe, 1980. But as a 20th century historian, you know, it was great to me because I know that's Reagan, 1980. You had OPEC, you had the stagflation, New York was bankrupt. I came up the hip hop, the grind and poverty, Newark, the South Bronx. So all that stuff. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing when I teach my hip hop class, when I show the students of the Bronx in the late 70s, they have no clue, with the gentrification, all the upgrades, they have no clue what
Right.
cities were. And I can imagine in smaller rural areas, probably relative, the same type of
Yeah.
structural economic challenges, low wage jobs. You had 1980 in Miami with Overtown. They killed the black guy again in 1980. So again, all these gripping problems, Reaganism, why we have the problems we have today. And on a global level, as you know, in Kenya, structural adjustment programs in the 80s, the conditionalities, so global capitalism pounding on people of color. And again, that's why it's imperative that we talk about Pan-Africanism, we share a lot in common. These global capital
Mm-hmm.
policies are grinding land, labor, and resources, right? Whether it's the United States, Nairobi, Accra, and we have to find a way to create our young people through social media to build networks to counter this stuff and stop arguing over, Nigeria and all this other nonsense, because capital doesn't care. They go wherever they can go. They don't care. You arguing, the Chinese are coming, everybody coming, you still arguing, they grabbing stuff, whether it's our culture, intellect, whatever. We got to start waking up and figure this thing out, because capital, they don't seem to argue. When they do their thing, they do their thing. So we have to develop the skills and the networks to combat this global pandemic of racial global capitalism.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So good. I totally agree with that.
Do you like that one, structural adjustment programs for you? In the 80s?
Yes.
Oh, great comment. I think that's about it. Well, I'm going to
All
sign.
right.
Ms. Fowler, we need to connect.
Absolutely.
We do.
African American
We do.
Studies. Check us out. We're building this thing up from the
Yes.
bottom. We're like an Apple stock in 84. You better invest now, because in 10 years, you'll be like, man, I can't afford it.
Well,
All right.
thank you for giving me 10 more years to begin with. But the other thing is that I chair the restoration and I'm CEO for the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center, which
Okay.
is an African American. We're new. We're not very old, but we are full of history. We're not
Okay.
meeting now because of COVID-19. But you're the kind of people that we want to share the history
Well, we'll
there
definitely
at some
connect.
point. So
Like we had COVID. Hopefully next
yes,
fall,
go on Facebook and
we'll
find us.
definitely connect.
All right.
All
All
right,
right,
very
y'all.
good.
Have a good evening.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Yes.